Hi, my name is Jonathan Skinner, and this is an attempt to cue you into the concept, the tourist gaze. And I want to give you some introduction to John Urry's concept and to use some experiences to demonstrate how visual and how organized or institutionalized the tourist experience is. So I'm starting with the first image, which is a photograph of my father being sold one of a number of tourist experiences in Marmaris in Turkey on a cruise, and you'll see how visual the photograph is of the postcards, of the pictures of the boats, of the experience of the Turkish bath, of the people on the pedalos in the background, and postcards on the right. So the whole tourist experience is being framed, and it's almost as though he's been assaulted by this attempt to sell an experience for the tourist whilst on vacation. So for me, this is a powerful image, and it's one that I really wanted to use as the cover of this book I co-edited with my colleague, Dimitrios Theodosopoulos, anthropologist at the University of Kent, good friend and colleague, called Great Expectations, Imagination and Anticipation in Tourism several years ago. And we wanted to draw attention to the nature of the imagination in the tourist experience and how it's about expectations that are sold to the tourists and then are confirmed or disconfirmed, not confirmed in the tourist experience. And that can lead to dissatisfaction if it's not confirmed. But essentially, there is a marketing industry that sells a product for the tourist consumer. This is very much based upon the imagination, upon fantasy, as we'll see in a minute or two, and upon the visual nature of the experience. So instead, we ended up with the Colosseum in Rome as the cover of the volume, but it was a toss-up between these two photographs. I think the detail on the one on the left and the family link was the defeating points, shall we say. So I'm trying to talk about the concept of the gaze and how it's been applied by the sociologist John Urry. And it's a concept that is important in terms of how we make sense of our lives, how we gain insight, quite literally insight into our lives, how we make meanings and how we understand life around us. So it's engaging with a concept called semiotics that I'll get into, the science of signs. And the main point is that in the tourist industry, what you see and what you experience is organized. It's institutionalized. It's being controlled. It's being ordered by the tourist industry for the tourist, in this image, my father. And what John Urry is doing in the tourist gaze is applying a concept from the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who wrote about the idea of the gaze, what we look at, what we see, and what's behind it in this ocular-centric society of ours that concentrates upon this very dominant sense. And Foucault develops the idea of the gaze, and John Urry applies it to tourism, hence the tourist gaze for Urry. But Foucault was writing about the gaze in his book, The Birth of the Clinic. And this is where he traces the rise of modern medicine. And it's about the clinic and the gaze that Foucault writes, the clinic was probably the first attempt to order a science on the exercise and decisions of the gaze. The medical gaze was also organized in a new way. It was no longer the gaze of any observer, but that of a doctor supported and justified by an institution. So Foucault was looking at the doctor doing his rounds around the hospital a 20th century practice, 21st century still, whereby the doctor just looks at the patients. And in that gaze, there is a whole background of power, of medical knowledge. That gaze upon the patients is seen as being not a harmless, simple glance, an enjoyable, leisured look, but is one of a calculated, learned medical examination. You might say it's the doctor searching for symptoms that lead to the doctor's diagnosis and cure. This Foucauldian gaze Urry adopts and applies to tourism. For Urry, we gaze at what we encounter. And this gaze is as socially organized and systematized as is the gaze of the medic. So what we're trying to say is that in the tourist industry, there are experts who construct and develop our gaze. They decide what we tourists see of a place, how we interact with the tourist destination, what we take away from the place. For example, if you visit Disney World, the illusion of make-believe is fabricated and sold to the tourists. In London, the tourist is attracted and signposted to the London Eye, not to Whitelands campus, for example. This means that people are deciding where and what and how the tourist consumes the product. So this tourism is organized, planned, and systematically institutionalized. It's run by the Disney Corporation, or by the National Trust, or English Heritage, or the English Tourist Board, or, as we'll see in a couple of examples, by the cruise shipping industry, such as Cunard Lines. So in this gaze, Urry argues, we have a gaze from place to place, depending upon the culture and history of the people who are the tourists. The tourist destination depends upon what the tourist wants to see, and what the tourist wants to see depends upon what class or background or interests the tourist has. The job of these people marketing the airport transfers, the rent-a-car, the roads experiences, the quad safari, the rafting, the jeep safari, the diving, the boat trips, the water park, are to sell that experience to my father and to try and tap into that background that they think he will want as a visiting tourist, as a short-term visiting tourist coming off one of the cruise ships, one of the several thousand visitors from that cruise. So this way of looking at tourism is one which gives little role to the individual tourist sitting there. They're quite passive. Tourism is organized by Durkheim's society. It is constructed upon difference, the difference between the tourist's workplace and their perceived leisure destination. So Urry's aim is to consider how social groups construct their tourist gaze, and how the tourist gaze is institutionalized, because this is a good way of getting at just what is happening in normal society as well. Urry notes that tourism has now moved from the Fordist mass production tourism, such as the British holiday camp or seaside resort, to a more post-Fordist era where consumption guides production, and holiday camps are now renamed holiday centers, holiday parks, holiday worlds, places of freedom. Urry recognizes that travel indicates status, and that tourism provides thousands of new jobs per week, or did until the lockdown and the furloughs, and accounts for 6% of all UK consumer expenditure. Urry knows the importance of tourism, but to look at the inner workings of tourism, he turns his imperial gaze towards guidebooks. The tourist gaze is assisted by the guidebook, the brochure, and even, you might say, the postcard and souvenir. For example, Baedecker's Paris guidebooks at the turn of the century in Victorian times mentioned the sewers, the morgue. The old guidebooks, along with the new guidebooks, frame the tourist experiences. They either tell the tourist what to look for, what to avoid, where to take photographs. They give advice, hence TripAdvisor, when you're going on a holiday. Even the little guidebook, which fits into the tourist pocket, is not harmless, according to Urry, but a powerful means to control where the tourist stays, what the tourist sees, what the tourist does, where the tourist spends their money, what the tourist spends their money on. The guidebook is a part of the process which controls the tourist experience. So Urry summarizes some thoughts working from the architecture scholar from California, Dean McCannell, in his book, The Tourist, and suggests that tourism is a quest for authenticity. It's something that we'll explore through this course. And the work of Malcolm Crick, who suggests that all cultures are staged. And of Victor Turner, that tourism is a liminoid period when everyday obligations are suspended or inverted. Urry develops even the idea of post-tourists, tourists who delight in the inauthenticity of the normal tourist experience. You might say postmodern tourists, a phenomenon and a concept that we will explore as well. These are tourists that know that there is no authentic tourist experience, that they're merely in a series of tourist gazes or tourist games that can be played for their entertainment. So Urry is talking about a service industry, one that services the tourist appetites or the service of tourist desire for an authentic experience. The tourist industry service changes to suit that, and yet it controls the tourist, and increasingly it controls not just the tourist gaze, but the entire tourist experience. And this is what I want to go on and give some examples of. So that's the tourist gaze. And we want to apply that now to some examples and case studies. This is a picture of the Queen Mary II, which is one of the Cunard Line's 3 cruise ships. The Queen Mary itself is a ship that was from the 1930s and is currently harbored in Long Beach, California as a heritage object, and was one of the transatlantic liners that, as the billboard or the poster shows, offered the fastest ocean service in the world, for example, from Southampton to New York. Queen Mary II is the last remaining transatlantic liner, a passenger liner transporting people across the Atlantic or from one location to another, as opposed to a cruise ship, which is more about the leisurely cruising that probably takes the passenger back to the departing port. The Queen Mary II is still in service. It is offering around the world packages in 2022. It's currently suspended due to COVID. And these images show the opulence and its associations with the sort of Victorian era of the Titanic, and quality, luxury, and the segregation of passengers between first class, second class, and third class. And incidentally, 1930s, 1934, Cunard Lines bought the White Star Line, which produced the fated Titanic. And you can see walk-through tours of this last existing cruise ship. These are some pictures of the dining room, the split-level dining room on the left for me, and on the right, one of the walkways, presumably through to one of the auditoriums or theaters. It's currently offering cruises, and its strap line for Cunard Cruises is to sail beyond your imagination. And this, for me, taps into that whole idea of imagination, expectation, desire, the fantasy side to these experiences for the tourists that's predicated upon difference into their ordinary lives. And to give you examples of cruises, 7 nights, the Norwegian fjords, the magnificent mountain scenery that lifts the soul on this round trip from Southampton. Glide through valleys and glistening lakes to wild beaches and colorful cities awash with UNESCO sites. 7-night cruise, £749. And some people are very much attracted to these holidays that are no-fly holidays. You can have your transport pick you up from your home, bring you with your luggage to the departing port, usually Southampton, and it will collect you at the end of the voyage. So it appeals to the retired, to people wanting a leisured cruise, to people not wanting the hustle and bustle, the stress of flying. And to some extent, there's an appeal that every day you're waking up in a different destination, and you're opening your cabin windows, if you're lucky enough to have a porthole or to have a balcony, and you're seeing a different place. So you're letting someone else do the traveling for you. This appeals to John Urry's recent work on the tourist gaze, re-evaluated, where he concentrates more upon the idea of the mobility that goes behind, is embedded behind the gaze, whether it's a stationary gaze, whether it's a person on a bicycle or in a car, in a coach, or on a cruise ship or on a plane. So the Queen Mary advertises itself based upon the imagination, tapping into ideas of glamour, adventure, and luxury. It's the last remaining transatlantic liner in the world. It was commissioned in 2003, 13 decks, travels maximum speed 30 knots. It flies under the Bermuda flag, but is part of the British business Cunard Line as part of Carnival Corporation, home base, I think, Miami. It's a large ship. It has 2,600 passengers and approximately half, again, a number of crew and one captain. Burns 500 tons of fuel per day. We will look at sustainability and the impact that cruising has upon the Caribbean later on in these sessions. In those 13 decks, it has 8 restaurants, it has a theater, it has a planetarium, it has the ability to stage large shows and host audiences, it has numerous shops, it has art auction rooms, and it's also considered to be a post-Panamax ship, in the sense that it's so high and so wide that it doesn't travel between North and South America through the Panama Canal. It has to go via the tip or the tail of South America to travel around the world. And it does travel around the world. What's interesting about the ship, as you'll see from some of the images, are my work on the ship alongside my father, John Skinner, who was a destination lecturer. And for those of you thinking about employment, cruise industry, dealing with different peoples, different cultural destinations, it fits very well with anthropology. And you'll see here the dressing up for the shows and the theatre and the excursions, the cabin in the lower decks, a sort of split bed. We were lucky to have a porthole. Usually, if you're working on the cruise ships, you're on an inner-facing cabin, so you see no light and you have less air in the rooms. And the picture of me in the middle is on the captain's deck, and the job of the destination lecturer. My father was giving a lecture about one of the fjords on the left. Is to sell the experience to the customers, to talk to them about what they're about to see, and to sell the tour products of their excursions. And I helped out on the excursions. My father was selling the experience, and we count as crew, but we are afforded passenger levels of luxury to some extent. And each day, as you travel through the fields on that 7-day Norwegian cruise, you talk to the passengers about what you see on either side of the ship. So it's very much about sight, the visual nature of the experience. And this cues in semiotics, the science of signs. So this is an example of a 6 o'clock in the morning talk, a broadcast. My father telling the passengers what they're seeing and also what they're about to see from the prow of the ship. And we're lucky in the fjords to be able to say what is on port and what is on starboard. And the view on the left as the beautiful ship, Queen Mary 2, navigates its way up the fjords, I think following another ship behind it. So you're always anticipating what the tourist is seeing or about to see, and what is around that corner, underneath that mountain, the waterfall, the trolls, the castle. And just as a brief detour, from the Queen Mary to the Isle of Wight very recently, photograph of my dear wife, we visited a garlic farm on the Isle of Wight in a out of season fashion. And it's interesting to try and work with this visual tourist gaze concept, to apply John Urry to Dean McCannell and his work on the tourist. So we've looked at semiotics, the science of signs, and how visually cued in we are in terms of the tourist experience and what we want as a product. Those liminal times when we are tourists are times when the tourist is looking for a particular experience. They've bought and paid for their trip, and they are receiving or hoping to receive the experience, the authentic experience, the real Norway. And yet the tourist gaze, we might say, is manufactured for the tourist. It's all thought out and worked out before. It's all pre-scripted, rather like that show, that performance of visiting the fjords. And the Queen Mary does this same 7-night cruise several times in the year. So we have semiotics. That it's a concept. It's a mixture of linguistics, sociology, anthropology. And Dean McCannell suggests that semiotics is key to the tourist attraction, that is part of the tourist gaze, hence the connection with Urry. McCannell believes that a sign represents something to someone. A little bit vague, but I'll try and qualify and specify. Dean McCannell, in his Tourist, is trying to argue that tourist attractions are signs. And he uses the term markers to try and expand on this, to mean that the information about a particular site, a plaque, a picture, or a title. And he suggests that, to some extent, those markers for the place are more important than the place itself. I'll get to the garlic farm in a second. So, for example, sightseers do not, in an empirical sense, see a place such as New York or San Francisco or London. They see particular places in them: Fisherman's Wharf or Alcatraz, a cable car, Golden Gates Bridge. They see then elements of a set of concepts that constitute San Francisco. Each of these individual items is a symbolic marker for San Francisco or New York or London. The city then is composed of numerous tourist attraction markers. Without seeing those markers, the tourist feels that they haven't seen the experience. They haven't done the destination. You haven't done San Francisco if you haven't seen the Golden Gate Bridge. You haven't done New York if you haven't seen the Statue of Liberty. So the bridge or the statue is more than just a large suspension bridge or a large image of a person. It represents a part of the city, San Francisco or New York. You might say in a metonymic fashion, the part standing for the whole. And it's the same in London, where the tourist sees Big Ben as the symbolic marker for London or the Houses of Parliament. The tourist visits the symbolic markers of the city. And the tourist experience is not complete without a view of those particular markers. And McCannell gives us an interesting example to elaborate on this that leads into the garlic farm. Now, copyright reasons, I'm trying not to use any pictures other than my own in these talks so that they can be public on YouTube. Otherwise, I would give you pictures of the books. So McCannell gives us an interesting example of the importance of the tourist marker. What it is he watched a young couple in the Washington, D.C. zoo in midwinter, when many of the birds had been, and the animals had been removed from the outdoor cages to protect them from the low temperatures. And there were several couples that were proceeding methodically from empty cage to empty cage, reading and discussing the illustrative markers on each of the cages. In this case, the symbolic markers for those birds were more important than the birds which they were signifying. So McCannell explores the relationship between the marker and the site, between the signifier and what is being signified, between the signs for the bird and the bird itself, between, for example, the sign for the garlic and the garlic object itself. So to give us the garlic farm, we're on the Isle of Wight, it's out of season. There are boards, plaques discussing the different types of garlic, where they're from, how old they are, how they are cooked and how they taste, what they look like. And beneath those plaques are examples of the garlics that you can find around the world. Outside of the garlic growing season, there's just a hole in the ground. And what was interesting visiting the garlic farm several weeks ago was, with my wife and son, was the fact that many tourists, it was a very successful tourist establishment, even outside of the season, were walking up and down this line of plaques, reading the plaques, looking at these markers for these types of garlic. In fact, the tourist attraction was still extremely popular. So it's similar to the zoo example, socially distanced experience here. Now, in linguistics, there is no connection between a word and the object it signifies. There's no natural connection between the word tree or ship and the tree or ship object. In other languages, the word for tree can differ. Arbre in French, Baum in German, tree in English. The connection then in linguistics is arbitrary. You'll see a ship behind me in the background. So the ship word is a signifier for the ship concept, which is being signified. And some of those of you who are eagle-eyed will see that we've shifted part of the world and ships to celebrity cruise liners in the Caribbean, in, I think, San Juan, Puerto Rico, on a Caribbean cruise. So McCannell is taking this linguistic distinction and applying it to tourism. I'll give you another example. For example, bonfire night. On bonfire night, people let off fireworks. They light bonfires. Why? What for? What does the social activity mean? To look at the semiotics of the activity, we see that the bonfire and the fireworks are the signifier. And they're signifying what? Well, Guy Fawkes's failure to blow up Houses of Parliament. Unfortunate. In this case, there is a closer connection between the signifier and the signified. To give you a tourism example, the relationship between the signifier and the signified appears with the connection between the Statue of Liberty and the concept liberty. Or we could say the Empire State Building is a site which serves as a symbolic marker for the sightseers' Manhattan. Or that the Statue of Liberty is also a site which serves as a symbolic marker for the United States. So a signifier can signify different things to different people. Liberty for an American could be oppression for a Libyan or a EU politician. The American dream for an immigrant. So from this, McCannell argues that we make sense of everyday life, that we sort of structure our lives around the understanding of these types of sign systems. The connection between the signifier and the signified, between the ship signifier and the ship concept, is where meaning comes from. It's where meaning comes from. And we'll explore other examples and illustrations from the cultural politics of tourism as we progress. So in some cases, McCannell argues that even the tourist sites are transformed into semiotic markers themselves. We can think of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier as both tourist site, a site destination, and a symbolic marker. It's a tableau of information as well as a site for visitors. It combines the two semiotic functions. So let me recap. McCannell and Urry believe that the tourist gaze is highly organized, that what the tourist sees and does is arranged and constituted. It's packaged and commercialized, controlled and institutionalized. And for McCannell, sightseeing is semiotic, to do with tourist images which are viewed and taken in by tourists, quite literally, taken in by small groups of people performing this sort of collective ritual. But not only is the tourist performing a ritual of observation, but often the tourist is observing a ritual. We'll explore this later on in this module. But for now, let me stop with this taster and we will pick up imminently.